All right, so we're going to start another discussion on another one of these in-depth analyses on our arguments. This one is going to be on a slightly different topic than what we've been going on before. This one is going to have different impacts, so it'll be nice to see a fresh face in that department. This time we're going to be talking about the argument about undermining third world countries. As always, just a quick little overview of what we're going to be doing in this video. We will explore the argument, move on to addressing what values and value criterions could possibly be used with this argument, and lastly, closing with rebuttals and my just general thoughts on the argument as a whole. So let's get into getting started and explain what the argument is saying just in general. So, as you can tell just from looking at this argument, this one is going to be more global based as opposed to the other ones, whereas it's just the relations of a couple of nations. This one is going to have a more specific, not connotation, but emphasis on what nations are actually being affected here instead of just general global effects. So this one is all about how we're going to be affecting, obviously, these poorer nations whenever lethal autonomous weapons are produced. So the main argument here is that we actually talked about this with the expensive arguments, but yeah, lethal autonomous weapons are not cheap to make, and most countries aren't going to be able to make them unless, like, obviously they are very rich and are able to put a lot of money into the defense budget. The argument here is that like third world countries, which obviously don't have the money to make these lethal autonomous weapons, are going to suffer as a result, and they're going to be less off in like combat than the other nations, and therefore like they're going to have more debts, or they're going to have like just generally they're going to be worse off than other nations. Truly, there isn't a whole lot more to it than that. My issue with this, and we'll talk about this more in rebuttals, obviously, is similar to the other one's argument that we talked about. The impacts aren't super strong here. There's not really a super well-defined impact that's given forth. Of course, we could talk about things such as how, like, there could be, like, more deaths, but that's not really unique to, like, lethal autonomous weapons, so that argument can't really be made. It's just simply that they're going to be at a disadvantage, but, like, there's nothing that's inherently bad about that. I guess you could say it's like unfair that these poor countries are being like harmed in warfare, but until you like, unless you want to run like an oppression or like Kantian framework, there's not a whole lot of meat to that argument. So that's why this right off the bat is a little underwhelming to me. The impact seems very weak, at least at my like current view of the argument. But truly, there's not a whole lot more to say about that because most of the discussion here would come on the impact, the actual like warrant, which is that these countries are going to be like not as well off as the other ones. It's pretty solid, unless you can find some system in which these poor nations are going to be able to get lethal autonomous weapons, which I would be very surprised if you could find one. Then, like, obviously, it doesn't matter, and this argument is going to stand. It doesn't matter if the impact matters. Obviously, there are rebuttals for it, but we'll get to it later. So, but anyway, on that note, let's get to the value criterion. As always, this has a lot to do with the impact, and we don't really have one here. I do think you could possibly go with a Kantian framework in talking about how like this is going to lead to greater oppression of these nations. But if you can find a stronger impact, then that's really what's going to help you. Possibly you could talk about how there's going to be greater imperialization of these nations because they're like more powerless. So I guess if you want to do something like that, then you could possibly, I mean, that would still be just a good one for like oppression. I think this one's definitely going to be like a justice and oppression based one or just general Kantian because like although oppression is like minimizing it is somewhat consequential, it's definitely like still deontological in sorts. And that's really what this argument has to be because like you're probably there's not really something you can weigh, right? Which is something that is like a good sign of a consequentialist framework. So this one's definitely going to be a lot more deontological. But yeah, I think that oppression and justice is going to be the better one. But if you want to talk about like the categorical imperative, you could possibly even uphold that, where you're just saying that like having these imbalances support just like colonialism in general is like inherently wrong and it breaks the categorical imperative. And you can even say it's like, I don't know, it uses people as a means to an end. Um, so you could potentially like access some of those frameworks and be like really well off. Beyond that, whenever we talk about rebuttals on this one, there's one that like is by far the strongest in my mind, and that's just that this argument is like wholly non-unique. If you really think about it, like yeah, like I said, the warning is pretty strong. These nations are going to be like way worse off than others because they're not gonna have the money to defend themselves. But like, do they have the money to have the weapons to defend themselves now? No, not really. Like, if the United States currently wants to go into, like, I don't know, like Nigeria or something, and, like, impose their will on them, what is going to stop us? Like, legitimately. We have the power to just do what we want with these third world nations. Having lethal autonomous weapons or not isn't going to change that fact. So that's the biggest one, is that just completely and utterly non unique. Beyond that, I think that no matter I really hate trying to outweigh on like a minimizing oppression argument because God, it just makes me feel like an awful human being, right? Like it literally sounds like you're saying, yeah, but like colonialism doesn't matter, which obviously isn't what you're saying, but I still think weighing on this argument is going to be something that you have to do. Is as we've talked about, there are a lot of high impact arguments on both the affirmative and negative side, and if you're like saving people's lives and your opponent doesn't, you got to outweigh on that. You just have to. Um, so that's a good one to hit there. Um, Honestly, otherwise though, I just think if someone runs this argument, you have to hit it with the non-uniqueness point and be like, it's just a moot point. I don't really think there's much return you can do because like possibly you could talk about how you can help third world nations because if they're able to produce it, I think that would be your one turn, right? Because if you could somehow prove that it's like not super expensive and that third world nations are going to be able to produce these weapons, then you could turn it and say that lethal autonomous weapons is going to be good for third world nations because now they have the ability to defend themselves when they couldn't before. Like let's take Israel for example. They have a decent amount of money, but like they're never going to be able to defend themselves because they just don't have enough people. Like I think they even still have like a draft where it's just like you turn 18 and you have to go into the military or something. I don't know. I don't know about the Israeli social structure. But like even with having like all the men serve, they're still like, they can't keep up. It's just the country's too small. So it's like, but if they have lethal autonomous weapons, then their lack of manpower wouldn't be as big of a deal because they can still support themselves via this way. So you could, and I know Israel's not a third world country, but you could like apply that same type of logic to most other countries. That was one I just knew for sure. So that's the one turn I could possibly think of, and like I think if you can make that work, that's a really strong argument. But I just think that it's kind of a stretch. It would just be better to go with the non-uniqueness argument because that one's not a stretch. It's like just perfect. But those are the three big rebuttals: just weighing the turn and the non-uniqueness. So you should definitely be fine with those. Anyway, just moving on to my general thoughts on this one. As I'm sure you could tell by like the air I've already given off, I don't like this one again. The non-uniqueness point just like destroys it for me, right? Like I think there are some times when you can kind of like get away with an argument that's non-unique, but this one is just like you're not actually helping anyone. Like the impacts are just wholly non-existent because at the end of the day, like nothing's actually changing. And if nothing's changing from the status quo to the affirmative world, then you like vote neg on presumption, right? Like, so it's just unfortunate where it's like if you're very clearly going to get into this argument where it's just this entire point is going to be a wash and then you just wasted your time. So definitely would not hit this one. But I'd be interested to see if some people are going to use this, right? I feel like this is one of those arguments that you prep for thinking that people are going to respond to it and then they never do. But like I'd be intrigued by this. I think some people might hit on it, and if they do, I think that's going to be really fun to hit around, even though it's partially just going to be because the argument is bad and you should be able to beat it pretty easily. But anyway, to be quite honest, like I said, other than just kind of throwing my thoughts out there and saying that I don't really think it's a super good one for reasons we already brought up. I really don't think I have too much more to say on this. So this was a bit of a shorter one, but that's okay. So, but anyway, on that note, as always, I hope this video was educational and I wish you guys good luck in all of your rounds.